Hey everybody, and welcome to part 2 in this series of getting this 2006 Screaming Eagle FatBoy back on the road after sitting a couple of years. Our last video had the bike trailered in where we cleaned it, found an abundance of engine insulation, which was very bad, threw it up on the lift, started our disassembly for the purpose of compression testing, which included lubricating the cylinders and finding no oil in the bike. But the compression turned out to be good in both cylinders, so we continued with the project by removing the gasoline and the heat shields, along with the oil-soaked air filter, then the gauge cluster, finally the gas tank, and all these old lights that were shorted and broken that were all over the bike, and their associated cabling, which I was happy to remove. We finished part 1 waiting for parts to arrive, and now they're here, so let's continue. Making our way over to the gas tank, we'll be loosening these screws using a T20 Torx bit. There are 10 of them, and they also have a plastic washer in between. I have a separate video that goes into the removal, disassembly, repair, and reassembly of these tanks in detail. Link in the top right will take you to it. I took a moment to clean up the middle of this gas tank. I really should have done this first, but at least I'm doing it now before I open everything up. The tank is now clean. I'll slide out this cluster mounting bolt, just lifting it up and putting it off to a safe place. And I just want to lift up the cover far enough to access the hose directly under it. And I can see that this one has never been removed before, as it has a factory clamp on it. And again, I'm using a small pair of needle nose pliers to fatigue the clamp. The clamp on this metal is thin, and it comes right off with no issue. I then use a flathead screwdriver to gently pry the beginning of the hose off of the fuel pump, and then pull the rest off with my hand. No problem at all. Back at the tank now, I lift up the cover, and with the removal of this spring, I'm able to flex out the entire assembly without any resistance. And once I get it out far enough, I'm just going to guide it with my other hand, because it does pivot, and there's some weight on there, until the whole pump clears from the tank all the way to the pickup. And we'll inspect the tank. As we take a look inside, happy to see that there isn't any rust, though we do see a lot of debris from the gasoline over the years accumulating down here. Absolutely fine. No rust by the crossover tubes. Everything here looks good. And nothing worrisome by our fuel filler or emission lines. I'm going to remove the electrical connector off the pump cover over here, as well as the connector off the pump, and pull that cable back through. We want to get all this out of the way before we start cleaning up the gas tank. So I'll put this off to the side. The bottom of the tank where the crossover tubes are has had stoppers put in them. And now I'll just put a splash of gasoline into the gas tank. Then I'll just pick it up and shake it all around to disperse the gas and pick up all those particles that I saw in the tank. With the tank leaning forward and on its side, I'll pick up that gasoline and all the debris with a clean rag, repeating the exact same process for the other side of the tank. Now the gas tank is perfectly clean on the inside. I think we could button this up now. So I'll reconnect the spring and guide the cable through the brackets, through the twist of that hose, and reconnect it to the pump. Snap in the other connector as well. The entire pump assembly is pivoted and reinstalled back into the tank. Notice that there's no resistance whatsoever, and everything falls right back into place, stopping only to grab this hose, which I will put a new clamp on and secure down onto the barb fitting and tighten down. I then bring the assembly in the rest of the way to full seat and secure all 10 of the screws. These are going into a rubber gasket, not metal, so I want to be absolutely sure not to over tighten them. I'm also using a star configuration when I tighten everything down. An inspection under the tank shows more of those LED lights, which I'm happy to rip off. I place the fuel gauge cable back within the stress relief and bend it down. And inspect the fuel line fitting for stains of any possible leaks. I don't see any. So that concludes our work on the fuel tank. My packages have arrived. Looking in the first box, we see this oil funnel for the oil change I'm going to do, an air filter, brake pads for the rear, spark plugs that were not really packaged, they're sort of hanging out on the box, but okay, whatever. And a complete fluids filter replacement kit for this bike. We're going to be removing the idle air control valve next. You'll see it conducted in this video with the air filter mounting assembly both on and off. To see a video specifically related to this job, click the link in the top right corner. This job is going to start with the removal of this cable from the rear of the valve. A T20 Torx will be used to remove the screws that hold in the support bracket for this valve. We can see it's also the support bracket for the throttle cables. And as mentioned, the bracket won't come off because the throttle cables are also supported. I'll then remove the air filter support, starting with the breather hoses. This one's filled with soot. And with a 1/2-inch socket, I'll loosen these 3 bolts, not to remove them, followed by a 7/16 deep well. This bolt was in, and this bolt was completely loose. So I'll turn these 2 top ones out by hand. We'll get a look at this one. This one is all sorts of sooty. And this one, as I pull it out, this one looks absolutely fine. Now these 3 studs can come out. And once they're out, I have to make sure as I remove this back cover that I don't break the gasket. I'm going to end up having to buy a new one. But it came out without any damage. So we're going to be able to reuse it. I just have to account for the 2 O-rings on the back. We now have easy access to the throttle cable ends, which we'll have to loosen by removing these rubber covers. You may elect to use a caliper to record the distances here before you remove them. After loosening the lock nut and turning it out, and turn this all the way out, shortening the length of the cable. I do the same thing on the other side, effectively making the cable shorter and allowing for more slack at the end for our next task. So I need only turn the end of the cable 90 degrees to get it to that slot where I can pull it out sideways. Do the same thing on the bottom one, turn it up 90 degrees, and then I can pull it right out that slot sideways. These cables are now released from the throttle, and I can pull them from the mount. Remembering the one with the spring is the one up front, and the one without the spring is in the rear. And put this bracket off to the side. The valve is gently rocked back and forth with upward pressure to remove it. And this thing looks nasty. And the port looks just as nasty too. With the O-ring removed, I start cleaning up everything with cob cleaner and paper towel. And it takes several sessions. There's a paper towel inside the throttle body, so it's not all falling through into the bottom. After about 2 minutes of work, I get everything here shiny new. So this portion is complete. Now, I was expecting the towel to stain with cob cleaner, but I wasn't expecting so many large chunks to fall off. See that right there? So I did give it a good cleaning, but there were multiple sessions of spraying, especially under the spring, where there was still large chunks of carbon buildup. Watch. See that? I wonder how much you need to inhibit it from closing properly all the time. It's possible that maybe this piece is defective, I don't know, or maybe just extremely dirty, but we're going to find out. So now it's all cleaned up, so dirt is no longer a factor. And if it ends up not working, I'll end up springing for a new one. The O-ring is inspected, replaced if necessary. It's then lightly greased. The connector should be facing downward, pressed in evenly and slowly, lining up the 2 holes. The one in the front has the spring on it, which is held captive in the plastic. Everything goes back together exactly as it was disassembled, just backwards. It's then seated into position. Each one has blue Loctite applied to it, screwed in partially until the second one is in, at which point both are screwed all the way down to remove the slack. At which point both screws are snugged down, and by snugged I mean lightly snugged, not stripping out the metal of the throttle body. Finally, the connector is plugged back in, completing this portion of the project. The rear cable wraps around, brought 90 degrees, back through and into position. Same method applies for the front cable, back into the track. I'll now open up the length of the throttle cables to the measurements they were before. turn out the locking nuts as well, but I'm not going to tighten them yet. I'll verify that they have just a little bit of slack, not rigid, but not loose, and that the throttle feels good. So I'll open and close it, make adjustments as I need to till it snaps back really nice, and I'm satisfied. Then I'll snug down the locking nuts. The rubber boots are pushed back over, and that's it. We'll take a look inside the throttle body, and we don't see any horror shows. It's not too dirty in there. The sensor in there doesn't look too dirty either, so we're going to leave this alone for now. I've cleaned up the air cleaner mount. We're ready to reinstall it, so we'll place it down on the tabs that located into position, and I'll start turning in these studs by hand to secure it, followed by the breather bolts, which I'll place in on each side. Then I'll draw the slack out of everything but not tighten anything down. I set my torque wrench to 65 inch-pounds and torque down all 3 studs. Then I set the torque wrench to 120 inch-pounds and torque down the breather bolts. Finally, pop in the breather hoses, which I've cleaned. And that's it. Onto the spark plugs, and the first thing I want to do is just measure the gap of the old ones, and I can see that they're sitting at 40 thousandths, so that looks to be correct. I'll measure the other one. Also 40 thousandths, so they were correct. We'll set up the new ones and take a look at what they are. Yeah, clearly not 40 thousandths, they're more like 33. So we'll just give them a little bend and open them up slightly and get them up to 40 thousandths. Another little bend, maybe one more. And now we have a 40 thousandths gap. We'll remeasure now, and we stop at 40 thousandths. Very good. We'll do the exact same thing with the other plug, getting it as well to 40 thousandths of an inch. I'll be using just a little bit of anti-seize on the threads of these plugs. And then each plug will be turned in by hand to full seat. And then once they're turned in, they'll be turned out and then back in again. And that's just to evenly distribute the anti-seize that's applied to the thread. Same process for the other plug. I'll set my torque wrench to 165 inch-pounds. And I'll torque down the spark plug. There's something about new spark plugs and that crush washer getting tighter and then looser. It makes you kind of think in the back of your mind you stripped out the threads. It's just kind of weird, but it's something you expect from spark plugs. Especially scary on the shovel head with the aluminum threads. That's why if you're new to this, a torque wrench is definitely the safe way to go. Now I'll drop on the boot because we're done here. But on this side, I want to clean up this mess first. So I'm going to take some carb cleaner. And I got a towel under there catching everything. And this is a stainless steel brush with very thin, soft bristles. And it gets in that aluminum, just being sure not to scratch any of the chrome. The primary reason is to give a good indication of any further leaking after these repairs. So we're going to bring it back to 0. I'm also going to remove the remnants of this melted plastic switch from before, which is so carbonized, it comes right off just like burnt oil. Okay, that's better. Pull out my towel now and use this soak towel to just clean up a lot of the dirt around the areas of the engine I usually wouldn't have contact with. Now I'll just plug my cables back in, everything cleaned up, and now the spark plug portion of this project is completed. In the first episode, we saw that the rear brake pads were almost non-existent, and we said we'd be swapping them out, so we'll do that now. We're going to have to control our rear brake oil level first and make sure that it's not too high, because when we push the pistons back, it's going to fill up and make an incredible mess if, in fact, it could push through it all with the cap covered. It's hard to see now that everything by Harley is made of plastic, but it doesn't look too terrible. I'll put in a paper towel, which will give us a good indication of the color of the oil. And we got a tinge of orange, which means it's ready to be changed, but it's not foul. I'm going to take out more because it is going to fill up when I push the pistons in, but the level was good when I opened it, which means there isn't any oil leaking out of the system. Also good. I'll just leave a small amount on the bottom right here, and that's sufficient. Now the official procedure is to remove the entire rear tire to do these brakes. It is unnecessary, but the alternate can in some ways be challenging. What I'm going to do is remove these two bolts, which isn't normally done in the alternate method, but we'll see why. And these are 10mm 12-point heads, which I loosen with some light percussion. And you'll come to find out shortly why I'm loosening these bolts. And immediately I see a new challenge on this bike. So I'll remove this bolt, and we see that the aftermarket exhaust is obstructing the bolt from removal. So I'm going to have to remove these slip-ons, and I guarantee you that it's not going to be an easy fight. So we're going to start lubricating this nut right here, which secures the strap on the sleeve, and I would almost be certain they did not use anti-seize when they assembled this. I'm using two ratchets with 1/2-inch sockets. One of them is deep well. Followed by these two bolts on the bottom using a 9/16 socket. Eventually I was able to work the clamp back and forth, which is only half the battle, because now I need to break the entire slip-on free and get it to rotate around in a circle, using lots of PB Blaster and an absolute ton of patience, rocking it back and forth very gently over the course of like 15 minutes. I was finally able to get this slip-on off. And it's no surprise, no anti-seize was applied. And now for the big reveal. Yeah, that's a big bolt that wasn't getting through the exhaust. So just to show you, the wonderful engineers at Harley-Davidson designed a caliper that cannot come out. It gets stuck in there. It's absolute genius. I'm going to put it back in a position now. I just wanted to show that. And I'm going to put these bolts back in because I want the caliper to be secure for right now. I just wanted to remove them temporarily just to show. And I'm not going to torque them down, just taking out the slack. Just want to make sure they're removable, that's all. So ideally what I want to do is get a flathead screwdriver in here between the pad and the rotor and just twist the flathead to compress the fluid in the piston, driving it back into the reservoir and getting that gap that I need to get the pad out. Eventually with enough gap, you could get the screwdriver between the bottom of the pad and the rotor and push it in even further. That's ideal. But there are two pistons on each side, and as you push one piston in, I find that a lot of times the other piston comes out a bit as one goes in, so it's sort of lopsided a bit. And while this does not make the removal of the pads impossible, it does make the putting in of the new pads very difficult in a lot of cases. Because of clearance issues, I have to use a shorter screwdriver for the rear pad, or the back pad as it were, making the pushing in of the piston even less effective because there's just less room to work and less to grab onto. It's just more difficult. Next, using a 1/4 12-point, I will loosen the locking pins. There are two of them right here. And once both of them are loosened, I'm going to pull them out one at a time. They go through both pads, obviously, out to the other side of the caliper. And you would think when I loosen this second pin and pull it out, these two pads are just going to fall right out. No problem at all. Even putting my hand under just in case. But yeah, nothing happens because the pistons are lopsided. And I actually have to use a screwdriver to guide the pad up and then slide it out from the top. And there's our first pad. Or if you want to call it a pad, there's really no pad left on this thing. That's really bad. And I'll guide up the back one now and pull that one out. Also, nothing left on this pad as well. I have our new pad kit, so we're going to open it up and look at the two pads for comparison. Yeah, that's a big difference right there. The two pins look okay. The threads look a little bit roughhoused from previous work, but they cleaned up, and then I went and applied some anti-seize, very light anti-seize to them. So we're going to reuse these pins. And here's the thing, without the pads, you could actually remove the calipers if you remove those two bolts. And now I could push in the individual pistons. And you can see as I push one in, the other one comes out. But now I could hold in one piston and push in the other, and we could seat these pistons properly. And that's why I removed those two bolts on the bottom, so I could get those pistons all the way in for the installation of the new pads. which will make it so much easier. I'm also able to inspect and replace the anti-rattle spring back there if necessary, something you can't do if you don't remove the caliper. Furthermore, I could actually install the outer pad outside the bike and put in the pin to hold it in place, not entirely, but just get things going so it doesn't fall out, and still be able to put that caliper into position, which gets us halfway done with the project before we even get going, and just seat this down into position. Now things start to go south here because the back pad absolutely would not fit and line up the top pin, and I was confused for a little bit as I had to research what was going on here. Notice what happened earlier when I pulled out the rear brake pad. Right over here at the end, we see a slight difference on the ear, as if it's cut away slightly on an angle. Now if you look at the ones that I've received on that ear, that angle does not exist, it's straight. That style brake pad is correct for my year, but not for my model across several distributors, including JP Cycle, Dennis Kirk, and Revzilla, and checking the model list and exceptions for each of those companies. So I inspected the Harley-Davidson parts catalog for this bike, and it turns out they were all wrong. It is 46721-06. So all these companies are off the same common database, and they were all wrong. So the simple matter of procuring the right brake pad is all that is required for the effortless swap out of these brakes. But you do need the right pads and the right information. And once that was done and we had the correct brake pads in, it was no problem to line these up. And I do have to use a screwdriver to push against the anti-rattle spring for the top pin. But when I do, that pin went right in. And then I put in these 2 bolts on the bottom. Drawing out the slack from those bottom bolts, as they'll no longer be removed, I can now go and snug down these pins. Remember, we're going into aluminum, so we just want to snug them down. Then I'll snug down those 2 support bolts with the 10 mil. I'm doing this by feel because we're kind of off the books here, but I do have the torque wrench set at just over 30 foot-pounds, just in case I go over that, and I did not. So I was comfortable with this setting. I set the pins at around 120 inch-pounds. We can see that the fluid level is higher, pushed back into the reservoir. We're going to pump up the brakes now to push the pistons out. And I'm just pumping that brake pedal with my hand until the fluid pushes the pistons such that the pad makes contact with the rotor. And then we're just going to stop because it'll be time to bleed the brakes. I'll leave the rear exhaust off until the brake bleeding is done. And that concludes part 2 in this series of troubleshooting, repairing, and putting the CVO2 back on the road after a couple of years. I hope you found this video enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Do me a favor, hit that like button down below, helps me out a lot when you do, and hit that subscribe button to get more videos like this when they come out. When the next video comes out in the series, a link will be posted in the top right corner. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?